You ever get that feeling like the whole setup of global finance? It's not as set in stone as we thought it was.
Yeah, definitely. Things are shifting, that's for sure.
And whenever you start digging into those shifts, one term that keeps coming up is de-dollarization. It's everywhere.
It really is. If you're paying attention to how the world's economy is working and how countries are relating to each other, this is a trend you really need to understand.
So that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. We're tackling this whole movement away from the US dollar. It's been top dog in trade and finance, like forever, but things are changing.
Big time.
We've been looking at some really interesting analysis, especially from the business standard. And our goal here is to break this down. What's driving it? What's happening right now? What could go right? What could go wrong? The whole picture.
Right, trying to cut through the complexity of it all.
Exactly. We want to make this super clear and relevant, especially for India and for anyone really who's trying to get their head around how the global landscape is changing. Thinking about those competitive exams like the UPSC, it's all connected.
Absolutely. And a major player in all of this, one to keep in mind throughout this conversation, is the BRICS Plus framework. They're really at the center of a lot of these developments.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. De-dollarization. What is it really? In practical terms, I mean. We hear the term, but what does it actually mean for how the world does business day to day?
So basically, de-dollarization is about the U.S. dollar's role shrinking, not being the only big player in the game.
Okay, shrinking in what way?
Well, think about it like this. Countries depend on the dollar less for international trade, for financial transactions, even for how they hold their reserves of foreign currency.
Instead of just dollars, dollars, dollars all the time.
Exactly. And they're looking at other options.
So when you say other options, what are we talking about?
A few things, actually. One is using other currencies more, like the Chinese yuan. That's a big one. And even the Indian rupee is getting more attention in certain situations.
Interesting.
Then there's gold, the classic safe haven. People are getting interested in that again. And then there's the whole digital thing, digital assets, like central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, new ways to handle international payments.
It's not just a hawk. Things are actually happening. I mean, our outline here says, why now? And it points to all these new financial and currency initiatives. What's really pushing this forward right now, especially within the BRICS Plus nations.
You're right. The sense of urgency has definitely increased. There are real efforts to build alternatives to the dollar-centered system. And the BRICS Plus group, they're a major force behind the momentum, no doubt about it.
Let's get into some specifics. First up, the mBridge project. What's the deal with that one?
Okay, so mBridge, it's a really cool example of this in action. It's all about creating a digital system for cross-border payments, but using CBDCs, those central bank digital currencies we were talking about.
Gotcha. So instead of using traditional banks, countries are using digital versions of their own currencies to make payments to each other. Interesting.
Exactly. Initially, central banks from countries like China and Thailand were involved, and they had support from the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements. That's basically a big forum for all the central banks to get together.
Makes sense. But here's where it gets really interesting. Our source mentions some speculation that the BIS might pull out of this project because of pressure from the U.S. I mean, presumably, the U.S. wants to protect the dollar's position, right?
Well, the Business Standard called it speculation, and getting official confirmation on something like that is tough. It's all very sensitive geopolitically.
Of course, yeah.
But the fact that people are even talking about this, it really highlights something important. This isn't just about making payments a bit faster or easier. This is about global power. The U.S. dollar, it's not just an economic tool. It's a big part of America's influence around the world.
I see.
So naturally, any move towards something different is going to get their attention. And maybe even some pushback.
Right. It's not just about efficiency, it's about influence. That's a really good way to put it. Now, what about those BRICS Plus initiatives themselves? We've got the BRICS Bridge and BRICS Clear. What are they hoping to achieve with those?
So think of these as new financial infrastructures, designed specifically for the BRICS Plus countries to make payments and financial transactions between them smoother.
Okay.
The big idea is for these countries to be able to trade and invest with each other more easily, maybe even using their own currencies more, without always needing the U.S. dollar as the middleman.
And just so everyone remembers, BRICS Plus now includes the original members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but they've added Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and Indonesia. That's a huge chunk of the global economy looking at these alternatives.
Definitely. The expansion itself is a clear sign that more and more countries want to move beyond that dollar-centric system.
Now, this petro-yuan market, this one's really fascinating. What is it exactly, and why is it so important for this whole de-dollarization thing?
Right. So the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, which they set up back in 2018, it lets you trade oil and gas using Chinese yuan.
Okay.
Now, historically, almost all of oil and gas trades were done in U.S. dollars. That's where the term petrodollar comes from. The petro-yuan market is starting to handle a decent amount of global oil trade and futures.
So what makes this significant for de-dollarization?
Well, big oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're increasingly willing to accept or even actively seek out non-dollar payments for their oil.
Wow, that's big.
It is. This increases the demand for yuan, obviously. But it also makes it seem much more credible, like a genuine alternative for trading commodities. And that's a sector that's been dominated by the dollar forever.
So countries that have always been paid in dollars for their most valuable resource, their oil, they're open to using yuan instead. That feels like a really fundamental shift.
I agree. It's a big deal.
And then there's the BRICS currency. They call it the unit. They agreed on it in principle at the recent summit in Kazan. What do we know about it?
So the unit is supposed to be a new currency for BRICS plus countries to use for financial transactions amongst themselves. The proposal, at least what's been reported, is that it'll be backed by gold, about 40%, and then the rest will be a mix of their local currencies.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a hybrid approach. They're trying to make it stable by using gold, but also reflect the strength and diversity of their economies by using their own currencies.
So they don't have to rely on the dollar for trade within their bloc?
Right.
Okay, so they're taking concrete steps, exploring different avenues. Now let's zoom out a bit. What are the potential global benefits, the upsides, if this de-dollarization thing really takes off?
One of the biggest potential benefits is less geopolitical risk for a lot of countries. Right now, if you rely heavily on the U.S. dollar, you're in a vulnerable position.
How so?
Well, you're exposed to U.S. sanctions or foreign policy decisions that use the dollar's dominance to put pressure on other countries. Remember when they froze Russian assets after they invaded Ukraine? That really showed how vulnerable countries can be.
Yeah, that was a big wake-up call.
Definitely. De-dollarization is a way for countries to protect themselves from that kind of pressure, to some extent anyway.
It's about diversification, not just economically, but geopolitically too. That makes a lot of sense. What other upsides are there?
Well, diversification is key, like you said. If we move to a system with multiple global currencies, it could balance things out. Less risk if we're not all relying on just one currency.
A more multipolar currency world.
Exactly. And we're already seeing early signs of that. The Petro yuan and the Indian rupee are being used more for international transactions.
What about the impact on individual currencies?
Good question. De-dollarization could make regional currencies stronger. If they're used more for trade within their own regions, it could boost their value and make them more stable.
An example of that.
Sure, India trading oil with the UAE and rupees directly, that's strengthening both currencies.
So countries have more control over their own economies?
Right. Plus, if you're not dependent on the dollar, you're not as affected by changes in U.S. monetary policy. Things like interest rate hikes that can cause capital flight and devaluations in other countries.
That makes sense. Anything else?
Oh, and gold is becoming more important again. It's seen as a stable asset, and the move away from the dollar is definitely contributing to that.
What about digital currencies? Where do they fit in?
Well, de-dollarization is definitely pushing countries to develop and adopt CBDCs and blockchain payment systems faster. They see these as tools to handle cross-border payments more efficiently and maybe even bypass the traditional dollar-based infrastructure.
I see. Examples.
China's eCNY and India's E. They're both actively working on this.
So there are some really good potential benefits, but of course there are always downsides too. Concerns about moving away from the dollar, what are some of the big worries?
The biggest one is probably short-term instability in the global financial system. The dollar is still a huge part of international trade and finance, so any sudden changes like shifting reserves or changing trade agreements could cause a lot of volatility in the markets.
Yeah, it's a massive system. You can't just yank out a major piece without expecting some tremors.
Exactly. And then there's the question of whether these alternative currencies are ready to step up. A lot of them just don't have the same level of acceptance, liquidity, stability, and trust as the dollar.
Like the yuan, rupee, ruble.
Yeah, they've got a long way to go before they're seen as truly reliable on a global scale.
And could this actually make the global financial system more fragmented?
There's a risk of that. You could end up with competing currency blocks centered around different major currencies. That might seem like diversification at first, but it could actually make international trade and investment more difficult if these blocks don't work well together.
That's a good point. And what about how the U.S. might react to all of this? That seems like a big question mark.
Geopolitical tensions are a real concern. The U.S. might see this as a direct challenge to their power, and they could respond aggressively. Trade wars, sanctions, economic retaliation against countries trying to ditch the dollar.
That's worrying.
Yeah, our source even mentioned the possibility of the U.S. threatening tariffs on BRICS countries that are pushing de-dollarization.
So big potential for global repercussions.
Absolutely. And it could hurt the U.S. economy, too. If the dollar loses its status, there might be less demand for U.S. debt, which could lead to instability. And because the U.S. economy is so big, that could have a ripple effect across the whole world.
One last thing from the downsides list is this exchange rate determination problem. What's that all about?
Basically, the dollar acts as a benchmark for exchange rates around the world. If it's not the main currency anymore, what takes its place? Using a basket of multiple currencies to determine exchange rates is much more complicated and maybe less transparent.
Right, so you can't just swap one currency for another. The whole system is built around the dollar.
Exactly.
So let's talk about India. What's their take on all of this, and what are the potential benefits and concerns for them specifically?
India is in a really interesting position here. They've been actively involved in the BRICS plus discussions about alternatives to the dollar, but they're also being cautious. They've said they don't want to undermine the dollar's role in global stability.
I can see why they'd want to be careful, but there must be some advantages for India in exploring these alternatives, right?
Definitely. For one, it could boost the use of the rupee internationally. If it's used more for trade, it could become a stronger currency.
Like with the oil imports from Russia?
Exactly. Plus, India would have more control over its own monetary policy. They could manage inflation and interest rates without being as affected by what the U.S. does.
Makes sense. What else?
Diversifying their foreign exchange reserves. Holding other currencies or gold could protect them from the risks of the dollar losing value. And from a strategic standpoint, relying less on the dollar and the SWIFT system could give India more geopolitical flexibility. They wouldn't be as vulnerable to U.S. sanctions.
So more autonomy, less risk, those are big pluses. But what are some of the concerns for India as they navigate this?
There are a few. One is the impact on foreign investment. If investors see India moving away from the dollar too quickly, they might get nervous.
Because they like stability.
Exactly. And diversifying reserves is tricky too. Holding other currencies or gold comes with its own set of risks. Those currencies could depreciate or the price of gold could fluctuate.
So new risks to manage.
Right. There's also the risk of becoming too reliant on the yuan, which could create its own problems. And we can't forget about remittances. A lot of money comes into India in dollars, and disrupting that flow could have serious consequences.
It's a tough balancing act for India, wanting more autonomy but also needing to manage risks and keep things stable globally. So looking ahead, what are some specific things India might do in this situation?
Well, they'll probably keep trying to make the rupee stronger, encourage its use in trade deals, do more currency swaps, and work within those BRICS plus frameworks.
Makes sense.
They might also try to make their digital payment systems, like UPI, Rupee, and the digital rupee, usable for international transactions.
Going digital.
Right. And diversifying reserves will continue to be important, gradually reducing their reliance on the dollar by holding euros, yen, yuan, gold, maybe even those IMF special drawing rights.
And what about managing risks?
For that, they'll need to keep their trade diversified, not just focus on the BRICS plus countries. They need to build strong relationships with other partners, too, like in ASEAN, the EU, and Africa. And they need to make sure investors still have confidence in the rupee.
A lot to think about.
Yes, a multifaceted approach is key.
This has been a really insightful deep dive into de-dollarization. For our listeners, especially those preparing for exams like the UPSC, this is clearly a big deal. It's complex, it's changing all the time, and it has major implications for India and the global economy.
Definitely. Understanding this is crucial for any participants to grasp what's happening in international relations, economics, and India's strategic position, both for the main exams and just for general knowledge.
Exactly. And it's not just about India either. This is a global shift.
It is. India's approach seems to be one of careful consideration, balancing their desire for more autonomy with the need for global stability.
So, thinking about everything we've discussed, what do you think is the most important long-term implication of de-dollarization for the global economy and for India's future? It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. It makes you wonder how the whole system of global finance might change in the future. What will it look like?
Fascinating stuff. If you found this deep dive helpful and interesting, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment with any questions or thoughts. We always appreciate hearing from you.
We do.
And just a reminder, this deep dive was based on analysis and reporting from the Business Standard. We encourage you to check out their work for more details on this topic. It's well worth a read.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure.